share my screen. Or we could continue to talk about the weather.
We must have exhausted that conversation topic in the last 48 hours as a nation.
Anyway, but yeah. And for the last few days, isn't it? Okay, well, thanks so much for joining this morning. I think most folks I can see on the call have been here before, but just as a reminder, 5Things is a morning meetup where 3 speakers share 5 key takeaways from one of their favourite non-fiction books. So I hope you'll leave this hour either a little bit smarter, if that's possible. I know we've got a smart bunch on here, or inspired to pick up one of the books we talk about today. We are recording this event, though you won't appear on the video unless you contribute. And if just please stay muted while the speakers are on. That'd be great. We'll hopefully have around, I don't know, probably half an hour. It might be quite a bit to sort of ask the speakers some questions. So if any questions arise whilst our lovely speakers are talking, and just pop them straight in the chat. We can get them later, though. I think today might be a little bit more free-form chat, which would be really nice. So, last time on 5Things, we had 3 speakers, one of which joined us today, Mr. Phil Adams. And Phil took us beyond human intelligence by sharing 5 things from The Ways of Being by James Bridle. Kath told us why dance is just so darn good for you via The Dance Cure by Peter Lovett, and Linda Marie shared her take on the courage to be disliked. All these videos we do record I record every session, and they're all on YouTube, so I recommend checking those out. I think this is like the 21st 5Things. I actually lost count, to be honest. So by the end of this event, we'll have explored like 63 books, which is 315 nuggets of pure, unadulterated wisdom that we've experienced. I'm sure everyone's experienced every single 5Things. And we have had some truly wonderful speakers along the way. Feel really lucky to have this lovely bunch on. So, as always, delighted to add 2 new speakers today. Unfortunately, Charlie, one of our Charlies couldn't make it. But we will say hello to Annalise Mackenzie and Charlie Cosham. Hi, Annalise Mackenzie and Charlie Cosham. First up, we have Annalise. Annalise is a user researcher with OVO. I was lucky enough to work with her for many years, and lucky enough to call her a good friend too. And we have a ton in common, which is lovely. And one of those things is a love of nature. So I was really delighted to say that Annalise has chosen to share 5 things from Our Wild Calling by Richard Loud. Annalise.
Thank you. Thanks for coming along on this hot kind of summer's day. So as Andy said, I'm going to be talking about this book, Our Wild Calling. It's got a really long title, so it's all about how connecting with animals can transform our lives and save theirs. This book is written by a man called Richard Louv, who is an author and a journalist. He's probably best known for his book, The Last Child in the Woods, which is where he looks at the relationship between children and the natural world. He's also known for coining the term the nature deficit disorder, which relates to the negative consequences on health and social behaviours as children have started to move more indoors and away from the physical contact with the natural world. And he's also commonly credited with helping to inspire this international movement reintroducing children to nature through outdoor education. So this book is about how encounters between humans and animals can offer a way out of an age of solitude. It's really about how all encounters, kind of big or small, can offer a bit of an anecdote to our feeling of being alone. He talks a lot about kind of taking away fear of the natural world and replacing it with a love of the natural world. And for me, I feel lucky enough that this book actually provided a bit of an explanation for something I felt quite fortunate to feel since I was a child. So like that feeling of like wonder and curiosity towards nature, and like that total empathy and love for things that are non-human. And I really think that anyone who reads this book, it's really impossible not to be affected by it. So even if you've not felt that feeling of wonder or curiosity since you're a child, it's a great way to get back into that. And it's been described as a bit of a manual for finding the kind of like nature's whispers, which you're able to hear kind of loud and clear. But as a child, you do that, and as an adult, you kind of forget. So my first thing is that as a species, we're really lonely. And it's quite I guess, a bit of a sad takeaway from this book. And when I first picked up, I kind of just assumed that the kind of connecting with nature and connecting with animals, it was about curing our own individual loneliness and as humans. And it is about that in a sense. There's definitely a lot of stories where animals have helped people and communities of people be cured of feeling lonely, which is a huge kind of epidemic in itself. But the central theme is actually much more to do about the widening gap between our species, so as humans and other living things on Earth. And as a species, we've grown distant from others through urbanization, so building barriers such as motorways between us and the natural world, through like urban design, so the way we design our cities, like think about kind of big glass buildings, like concrete structures, kind of mat side buildings, like no greenery anywhere. It just excludes like natural elements. We've literally blocked ourselves off from nature. And likewise, on a similar note, as we start to fall more into a virtual world, we're kind of blocking the natural one out. So even before the pandemic, I think loneliness was rivaled as kind of a higher risk to health than even smoking or obesity. So it's a real problem. And as he says, it's actually like that kind of sense of human loneliness is deeply rooted in our own species loneliness. And Louv talks a lot about how, as a species, we're really desperate not to feel alone in the universe. So we seek it out. If we literally fly off in rockets and off to other planets looking for other life. But his point is that we're not alone. And if we only pay attention, if we open our ears and our eyes, in urban areas as well as natural areas, life is literally under our noses and it's all around us, and we just have to be open to be aware of it. And humans feeling alone among themselves in the world, it's because they've kind of forgotten to live in harmony with other living things. And I think the main thing that I took away from that, it's not kind of about like skipping through the trees with like cartoon birds singing above you or anything. It's just about being aware and having a respect and kind of, I guess, a bit of showing a bit of kindness towards all living things as we kind of go about our day-to-day lives. So my next takeaway was that all encounters with animals, big or small, can be transformative. So throughout this book is made up of lots of different tales from scientists, from everyday people, from conservationists, people that have had transformative encounters with animals. And I was really hoping to have like in the lead up to today's talk, I was like, I really hope I have some sort of transformative experience that I can talk about. And I imagined like a soulful experience with a fox or like a crow that became my friend or something, just something like quite wild. And I did actually have an experience yesterday, but it was with a hoverfly. So I was, there's a place that I like to go running near my house in Bristol, which is set in this gorge. It's a lovely woodland and there's all these trails, and there's this particular spot I like to just go because it's nice and quiet and I like to run through, and I stopped because particularly unfit. So I'd stopped and I was just taking a breather. And I looked up through the trees, and there was a hoverfly, which isn't unusual at this time of year, and it was just hovering above me. But I just felt quite just drawn to it. It was just a beautiful light kind of shining on it, and it kept buzzing off and then coming back again to that exact same spot. So I just found quite intriguing, and I don't know if they were using me as a point of reference or not, but I just watched it for ages as it kind of went and came back again. And then I kind of, after a few minutes, suddenly thought, I wonder if they actually know that I'm here. So I like lifted my hand to see if it responded to that when it was hovering near me, and it did. It went up again, and I thought again, like, oh, it's probably just because I'm sweaty, and hoverflies like kind of human sweat and that kind of thing. But it suddenly just turned almost like kind of like a helicopter just on the spot and just stared at me. And it felt for me like a good 20 seconds or something. It was probably like half a second. And then it flew off and didn't come back again. And while that, it probably, I don't know if the hoverfly was aware of me as a human, of my existence. But we had a moment, and this is something that Richard Louv refers to as the habitat of the heart. So that feeling when you have a connection with something, be it human, but also it can happen with an animal. So when you have a moment with like a dog, for example, like where you just feel like that sense of love. He talks about it as like an emotional kind of sensory, relational, and spiritual connection between ourselves and animals. And he says all these encounters can produce like altered states of consciousness. And I guess that's the feeling you have when you have like a kind of wow moment, like that feeling of awe for something else. And it can really kind of slow down your perception of time and scale and just kind of like ground you for a minute. He kind of talks about how like the human species has like, I think traditionally it's like 5 or something like we talk about, but a lot of scientists believe that we have 9, 10. Some even believe we have to have up to 30 senses, which we seldom use. And connecting with animals in this way can open up so many more senses. I don't know what any of these are, but I think that's pretty cool. But anyway, it just reminded me that the facts about the fact that connecting with animals in non-human life, it doesn't have to be big or epic. Louv isn't saying you have to go out and have like a moment with a panther or a snake or anything. It's just, it can be as simple as having like a bit of a moment with a hoverfly. So my next point and my next takeaway is, it's something that I learned and I've taken away and kind of adapted into my thinking of day-to-day life, is that being a caretaker for the earth implies dominance. And I must confess, like before reading this book, I would have probably proudly referred to myself as a bit of a steward or a caretaker of the earth, someone that loves nature. I'm here to look after it. However, like while this is quite noble, I guess, and it does have, it's a nice thing to kind of think, it still implies that you see yourself above all other living things. And the one thing that Louv is quite keen to kind of get across in this book is that you're part of nature. We're part of this cycle, and we're all part of the same thing. We've all come out of the same thing, and humans are not above it all. So it's a kind of give and take relationship. So we give to nature and they give back again. And like our traditional relationship with nature ranges from dominion to stewardship, and dominion kind of leads to destruction, while stewardship, while it's kind of more ethical framework, it just implies that humans are caregivers of nature. Whereas nature, in fact, probably takes care of us much or even more than we take care of it. And he demonstrates this by loads of examples of how nature is given so much to us. But I think my favorite example was there's emerging research around the idea of our early relationship with wolves. And I guess the general thought is, the kind of general understanding is that we domesticated the grey wolf, and that allowed them to evolve into what we call the majority of dogs nowadays. So domesticating is something that implies that they behave maybe more civilized and less wild. But there's a group of scientists who have quite a lot of strong evidence to suggest that wolves were in fact the ones that domesticated humans to a point, including teaching them things like ethical behavior. And this really blew my mind. It's something that really made me kind of rethink even how I interact with like a day-to-day dog. Like I love dogs. I don't have a dog right now, but I have grown up with dogs. And what they believe is that between like 10 and 30,000 years ago, wolves were the ones that picked us. So by this scenario, wolves probably scavenged on the bones and scraps that hunters had left behind. Soon enough, we became hunting partners, each using our strengths to strive, etc., etc. But the most intriguing part of this theory for me is that wolves adapted us to meet their needs. They civilized us and they domesticated us. And the closest example of human morality in nature that scientists have found is that of the grey wolf. And they talk about the fact that wolves for millions of years have had the ability to cooperate with one another, looking after not only their own young, but other pack members, sharing babysitting duties, that kind of thing. And all of these traits in wolves predate human social skills. So there's a really strong theory to suggest that wolves kind of taught us how to behave as a pack and behave ethically and look out for one another. And I think going that step further, admitting that we learn something from animals is something that's quite alien to most people, which is probably to do with centuries of evolution that has made us see the animal kingdom as something to be endlessly exploited and taken advantage of. Yeah, and he kind of puts across the point that this is maybe what has kind of left us at the stage where we're now facing these like kind of really serious consequences of kind of extracting as much as we can from the animal kingdom, such as climate crisis and mass extinctions, which is leading to the collapse of biodiversity and something we can't really ignore. So yeah, it kind of takes me on to my fourth point around making space for all living things. And there is hope, I hope. One of the things he talks about is how there's a movement where urban centres are kind of making space for animals and for nature. And as our urban centres grow, like more and more people are going to populate these areas. Inevitably, we're going to encroach more and more on the habitats of other living things, which we already do. And we're not making space for them in our cities. In fact, we're encroaching on their space. And when they come into our cities, we're kind of aghast and want to get rid of them. But there's great examples of cities designing for this peaceful coexistence, and they're called biophilic cities. There's a global biophilic cities network, and their purpose is to support cities with planning for greener urban existences. They define a biophilic city as a city that makes room, essentially, for all living things. And Singapore is a really good example. I've never been, I really want to go now. But it's an absolute shining example of what a biophilic city should be. And they've even changed their motto from the garden city to a city in the garden. They've created huge canopies to moderate the air temperature to provide shelter for all life. Their hospitals enshrined with huge ferns. They've got otters that have returned back to the rivers. And the benefits of having animals amongst us and removing that barrier of fear is beneficial for us in so many ways. So tackling loneliness, giving us more empathy towards the natural world, taking away the fear. And you can make space for all living things by just being kind to them. And it's something we can even do kind of like starting today. So if you see a snail kind of that's right in the middle of a path, you can move it to the side of the path so it doesn't get crushed, like that kind of thing. Maybe don't swat the fly that comes flying into your house the next time it comes in. And my final point, my final takeaway is it's just a question that this book has left me with, and it's what would happen if we all fell in love with nature? So, well, reading the stories of this book, the huge and kind of dominating sentiment that emerges is love. And as cheesy and as cheesy as that sounds, it is something that is hugely powerful in the sense of if we feel love towards something, we're much more likely to protect it. Every every person that tells a story in this book has experienced a completely magical moment with animals, which they describe as having changed their lives. And it goes from a child is falling asleep alongside their golden retriever, and waking up and telling their mother that their heart is inside the dog. And then a scientist having this moment with an octopus where it's wrapped its tentacles around him, and after the initial shock, he swims with the animal and they become friends. To another scientist followed this rattlesnake for 10 years through desert sands. And finally, like, this is one of my favorite stories, a young autistic boy who didn't speak up until I think it was the age of 7, who was taking part in some horse lead therapy. And on a visit to some stables, he spoke for the first time and his first word was horse. And all of these stories are their love stories. And it's love that brings a lot of these people closer to the animal world. And in turn makes us have more empathy towards it, and therefore lets itself be taken care of. And Lou believes that without direct physical contact with the natural world, children's knowledge about the environment just becomes quite abstract, and they tend to see the world with problems that are overwhelming. Increasingly, people who care about the climate emergency or biodiversity collapse, they make a significant argument that kind of this abstract view of the world and more children kind of being brought up in this way will lead to kind of this disconnect and less of a want to, and less of a kind of need, I guess, to save it. And I guess the kind of counter question to this, it's kind of maybe more of a worrying question, is what if children never get the chance to fall in love with nature before they know of its loss? And it's something that just sat with me as this is really important. Children need to have that connection. They need to learn how to be curious. They need to not be scared of the natural world, because if they do, then who's going to be there to save it in the future? So to summarize, yeah, life is all around us. We just need to be open to it. Transformative encounters can completely bridge the gap between human and non-human species, even if it's just a hoverfly. Not just a hoverfly, the hoverfly was great. We can exist alongside nature, not above it. So we're not stewards, we're not dominants of this earth, we're just part of it. And reimagining how we coexist could really save us, could save us in our cities and urban dwellings. And how do we instill curiosity towards the natural world in children and nurture that into adulthood? And that's me.
Thanks so much, Annalise. That was so awesome. I've taken so many notes. I have so many questions there. That's so fascinating. A lot of it like massively resonated with you, as I'm sure you know. So yeah, if there's any questions, then either pop them in the chat or we can actually sort of chat about it in a wee bit, but we'll move straight on to Charlie. Hi, Charlie.
Hello. Brilliant. Well, what a talk to follow. That was so interesting and entirely different to what I'm about to talk about, which is what I love about this event. I'm going to try and draw some parallels, but I'm not going to lie. They'll be tenuous at best, because I've chosen to talk about a business book, but I've chosen a business book that I think is quite an anti-business book. What do I mean by that? Anyone that's read a business book has probably noticed it does one of two things. It either has one idea and it tells you in every chapter the same idea in a slightly different way, but it's basically could be summarized in a blog, or it holds back its one idea, makes you read 12 chapters of anecdotes, stories, the personal experiences of the author before you get to the punchline. Those business books drive me mad. This business book I love because it's inspirational, it's actually practical, so it gives you tools and techniques to use, and it's actually like a manual. It's a useful thing that I use all the time in my work, because I do a lot of work with organizations about how to change how they work, and this is kind of my Bible. So I'm going to preach to you lot a little bit about why this Bible I think is so interesting. I do need to apologise. I'm suffering with a hell of a cough and cold, so I sound horrific. I'm hoping we're going to get through 10 minutes without a coughing fit. If that does not happen, I'll start doing this via interpretive dance, and you'll just all have to guess what the book's about. We'll give it a good crack. So, Brave New Work by Aaron Dignan. What's it all about? Well, it's looking at how the world of work isn't working and what we can do about it. So what does that mean? World of work, how organizations are structured, how we think about how work gets done, how we set strategies, how we divide up resources in a company. All of those things haven't fundamentally changed since the Industrial Revolution. And that's really the premise of the book, is to say, you could look at an organizational chart from 1920 and you couldn't tell if it was written yesterday or 100 years ago. If you looked at a car from 1920, you could probably tell it was not built yesterday. If you looked at a suit jacket, you could tell it was not built yesterday. If you looked at any kind of kitchen appliance, you could tell it was not built yesterday. Organizations and their fundamental ways of design and operation have not evolved in the way that the world has. So what his premise is there is a better way. There is a better way of thinking about and getting our work done. And he gives some really practical ways to do that. So I'll run you through some of those practical ways. To start off with, though, I know this is a bit cheeky. I'm supposed to say 5 things. This is like a footnote of my first thing, okay? I'm just sneaking it in here and hoping Andy doesn't notice. First of all, just have a think about your own experience of work. So think back across your career, moments of frustration, moments where you've thought, why is this so hard? Why can't I get this done? Why does my colleague keep doing this thing? Have a think, then have a read on screen at some of the instructions that I've lifted out the book. And for those of you maybe on the move, I'll just read a couple out. So there's things like, insist on doing everything through channels. Never permit shortcuts to be taken to expedite a decision. Make speeches, talk frequently and at length. Always refer matters to committees for further study and consideration. Bring up irrelevant issues as frequently as possible. Haggle over precise wordings, etc., etc. You've probably seen some, if not all, of these things lived out in an organization. So you might be thinking, what is this list? Where does it come from? Is it a study of organizations and how they work? It's not. It's absolutely brilliant. It's taken from World War II. It was written in 1944 by a guy called William Donovan, who was in the United States. He was the director of strategic services. And William's job was to figure out, how do we sabotage our allies? How do we use people on the ground in countries to undermine and destabilize regimes? And he wrote a field manual that is full of things you can do day to day to just make life hard, to make things slow down, your ally less successful. So this excerpt is from the section on day-to-day business. It's 9 things you can do to sabotage a business. Now, what's scary is when you read it, you see a huge number of these things happening and playing out in day-to-day organizations. So my first thing is, scarily, organization design looks a lot like self-sabotage. The ways that they are set up, designed to run, to operate, looks a lot like this manual. And that's mad. It's completely crazy, but it also makes a lot of sense when you look at the history. So a very, very short synopsis of what the book explains in the sort of setup phase. And I will say what this book does well is balance out. It's not 90% setup, 10% punchline. It's about 10% setup, 80% really useful practical tools, and then 10% what can you do next. But in that 10% setup phase, he talks a lot about how organizations were initially sort of industrialized during the Industrial Revolution. A guy called Frederick Taylor came in and was basically fascinated with the science of how people do work. So if you imagine people in factories, if everyone's got their own innovative way of making a cog in a machine, you're going to have a bunch of different cogs. So he was focused on coming up with the one best way to do each task in an organization, writing manuals and training everybody and making sure everyone just got stuff done in the same way in exchange for a fair wage. So that was almost the initial premise of work, of processes and procedures to get stuff done. And in a way, that hasn't changed a huge amount. We have systems, processes, policies that say this is how we do things here, stay in these lanes and get your work done. So Aaron Dignan, the author, talks about that being like an operating system of organizations. It's like the stuff on your laptop. It's kind of invisible. It hums along and helps things work, but it's actually built on a set of assumptions and a set of sort of ways of working that we don't often challenge. So my second thing that I took away from the book is that operating systems of a lot of organizations separate thinking from the doing. Thinking is done by managers. Managers set strategies. They think about where we should go as a team, what we should be doing. The laborers, the workers, the frontline do the doing. They often don't get the chance to do the thinking. They're told, no, this is how we do things. When I thought about this sort of operating systems, how do they play out? Dignan gives a really useful example that resonated for me with kind of getting my head around this. If you think about traffic and how traffic is managed, there's two different systems that we see in our day-to-day lives. System number one, think of the intersection, popular in the US, right? Where a road cuts across another road. That is controlled by traffic lights. Rules are sort of set in stone using the technology that tells people when and how to go, and it manages a whole range of scenarios through that system. The implicit operating system there is saying, let's not leave the thinking and the judgment of how we're going to get across this road up to people. Let's manage it. It's a complex scenario. Rules can help. Let's put in technology and processes so that people can just obey. System number one. System number two is the roundabout. There's no technology at play in a roundabout. There's a loose set of rules and principles that you look to the one direction, you join the flow of traffic, and people generally get across a roundabout. There's no rules, there's no technology that kind of, it has to be managed and maintained. And interestingly, the number of deaths and fatalities is much higher on intersections than it is on roundabouts. And the cost of running intersections is much higher than roundabouts. But when a power cut happens, the roundabout still works, the intersection falls apart. They're two different operating systems for managing the flow of traffic, but they're built on different assumptions. One says that the rules and the technology should be enforced so that people just obey. The second says, trust people's judgment. A whole range of scenarios will play out if we have some principles to follow. So they're operating systems, and they're very similar to kind of how we can think about operating systems in an organization. So if that's the setup phase, Dignan has said, well, work hasn't changed much. We fundamentally have an operating system built that doesn't necessarily empower people to think as well as do. What's the solution? So the third thing is that the bulk of his book is talking about a different lens to think about how organizations work. He says that 94% of problems in business are systems driven, only 6% are people driven. So what he's saying is we need to tinker and change the systems of organizations so that people can do their best work. So his organization, which is called The Ready, have worked with hundreds of different companies to look at how they work, and they've come up with this canvas. Now, everyone in my field loves a canvas, a tool, a framework. Here's another one, but actually it's useful, and I use it all the time with companies. And the reason I like it is because it cuts across any level of an organization. So you could sit down with an individual who's really not enjoying their job, and you could look at this and say, where is their tension? Where is it their friction for you? Is it in compensation? Are you just not getting paid fairly for the work you do? Is it purpose? You do not understand what the point of your role is. Or is it in meetings? Do you spend 40 hours a week sitting in pointless meetings? So you could have that conversation on a one-to-one level, on a team level, on a functional department level, or on a whole organization level. Chances are there's going to be tensions that happen on an individual level that are sort of amplified at an organizational level. But what the book does is it takes these 12 domains, so purpose, strategy, authority, which are slightly different to how we often diagnose and think about organizations. We typically go in with quite a functional view. Let's look at marketing, let's look at strategy, let's work out what's broken. And this looks more kind of cross-cutting at those enablers. So he does a chapter on each of these domains, and each chapter is structured around a bit of an overview. So what is it? A bit of a sort of set of thought starters to challenge the assumptions we all hold about things. Then it gets really practical. How can you take action? What questions could you be asking your team, yourself, a company you're working with to start to tinker and sort of challenge those things? And so it's sort of 12 rapid chapters that are super practical. So for anyone that works in this field, I couldn't recommend getting this book highly enough just to dig into those. They're really open about, here's some, tried and tested things, here's some watch outs, here's some stories from clients we've worked with. So really, really helpful. Now, the constraints of 5 things means I can't talk you through 12 domains because Andy would blow up if I attempted that. So I'm not going to go through each of them. Happy to chat about them if we have time at the end, if anyone wants to dig into them. You can find a really nice blog on Medium by The Ready, which has sort of an overview of this canvas, has an image of it, breaks down a few of the domains. So I'm happy to sort of chuck a link in the chat at the end if anyone wants to go and have a sort of the short version before committing to the full book. But really useful, practical way of doing things. So if the bulk of it is giving you this framework and this sort of set of questions to use to diagnose what's going on, you then go, well, okay, how do I get started? If I discover that my team or my organization's strategy is completely off, what am I going to do about it? Now, again, he sort of challenges the status quo here. So a typical consulting firm would come in and say, right, we'll do a transformation plan. Let's plan for the next 2 to 3 years, stick a load of people in it, build a long roadmap of activity that makes us all feel comfortable and like we've done something, and off we go. Now, Dignam points out that organizations are complex things, right? They're full of humans who are complex on their own. They're even more complex when you put them in a room together. And then there's the world within which the organization works, which is complex and changing. So pretending we know what's going to be important in 12 months is a fallacy. So instead, he promotes a more experimental approach where you start really small, you try some stuff out, and you scale up from there. So it's very sort of embedded in the culture of lean startup and design thinking and sort of those schools of thought. So my 4th thing is about his practical approach to getting started. He has this sort of mantra of start by starting. And he gives us sort of a 3-step process, which I just dropped a quick picture in of that 3-step looping process, he calls it. So step 1 is to sense sort of tensions. What he means by that is this language of tension is the gap between where you are and where you want to be. We typically think of tension as a negative word, but actually he says it's a space of possibility. It's where things could be different. There is potential. So tensions show you in an organization where something's not quite working. They've developed a set of tension cards you can see there, and you can buy them on the website for an extortionate amount of money. But he lists them all in the book as well, so you could just also go and get them from there. But some examples of some tension are things like our processes get in the way of work. Our processes get in the way of our work, or we reflect infrequently, or we don't know how to say no. So he's got something like 72 tension cards, and he sits with a team and gets them to filter them down to 7. What are the biggest tensions holding you back? Then he has this concept of proposing a practice. So a practice is what's something we could do that would be better, that would improve or tackle that tension. Again, in the spirit of capitalism, he's built a set of cards there that you can buy, also get them in the book, that enable you to get some experiments and practices built. So things like start by stopping a meeting, process, or habit that holds us back. So he uses a brilliant example of a strategy meeting that one client all finally admitted was a total waste of time. And they spent a few minutes working out how much it cost the business with all the prep of the slides and the charts and the time of people in the meeting, it costs them about £3 million a year to run this one meeting, 1 hour a month, plus all that prep. They canned it the next day and they saved their business £3 million. That's a practice that, because they spotted a tension and had an honest conversation about it, helped them to evolve. So you spot those tensions, propose a practice or a different way of doing things, and then agree a time-bound experiment. So let's try something for a short period of time that feels safe to have a go and see if it improves. So in the spirit of learning, let's see what we get from it. So a really kind of agile way of doing things, but it's effective. You know, it stops you coming up with theories and sort of philosophies on slide decks and gets you into the trenches making the change. But he recognizes people come to him and say, that's all very well. You've made a change in the marketing team over here or in finance over here. We've got a whole organization to run. How do we scale that up? So the 5th thing is a very short summary of quite a long section, which I've tried to boil it down to kind of 4 things that he talks about how you scale this. The first thing is criticality, which I'm pretty sure is a word they made up. But essentially, it's kind of Malcolm Gladwell talks about the tipping point. So where you go past a point of no return. Criticality is when enough people in an organization have experienced and enjoy this new way of working that they can't imagine going back to the old way. It would feel like a step backwards. So criticality is where you've built that kind of groundswell of change. The second is continuity. So unlike a lot of consulting firms, they don't want to be around forever. They don't want to build dependency. So they talk about the people who've experienced the change become coaches for the next people or teams trying the change. And then you can almost build sort of communities of these coaches who share learnings, experiences, but also can feed back to sort of senior management or whatever on some of those changes that are happening. The third one deserves a talk in itself, not a bullet point, but psychological safety, which is, for those of you that aren't aware of the work Amy Edmondson did at Google back in 2012 now, she studied what helps teams thrive and came up with this concept of psychological safety based on the research that said teams that do well typically are good at sharing airtime, so everyone has an equal chance to talk, and they're good at understanding and empathizing with one another's feelings. So it's about creating an environment of support and nurture where people are then able to try stuff out, experiment, even fail, and not feel consequences negatively. Without that safety, he says, a lot of this kind of experiment-driven work can't happen. It just, people don't have the permission. So there's a lot of work to do, and he gives, again, some useful tips on how to get some of that built. It's not flipping a switch. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's the kind of softer stuff, the touchy-feely stuff that, when given the right attention, can create the huge change. And then finally, the one that if I had £1 for every time a client doesn't do this, I'd be a rich woman and not work anymore. But giving people space, time to do stuff properly, time to experiment, time to try. There's a kind of the classic business cartoon you might have seen of a load of people, cavemen, I think, rolling a wheelbarrow up a hill, and it's got a square wheel full of stuff, and a guy's going past them, one guy with a wheelbarrow with a round wheel. He's like, hey guys, you should look at this. And they're saying, no, sorry, we haven't got any time. We've got to get this done. And it's that classic idea of we're so busy doing what we're doing fast, we don't have the headspace to look at something that could improve things. So space, absolutely critical. So look, I've done a whistle-stop tour through a very nasally voice telling you about this book. There's a lot in there. I hope there's some useful nuggets. I'm really happy to talk about any of them at length, as you can probably tell. But a quick rundown. So organization design looks a lot like self-sabotage. It's built on some of the things that people tried to take out enemy states. Operating system of many organizations separates the thinking from the doing. If you take that away, I think you'll really start to notice that. A lot of my work is trying to bring those two things closer together. The operating system canvas offers a different lens to rethink how organizations are run. the practical bits. So start by finding those tensions, proposing practices and conducting experiments. And then finally, scale comes from 4 things: criticality, point of no return; continuity, you've started a sort of wildfire across people; psychological safety; and space. I will leave it there.
Oh, that's so awesome, Charlie. Thanks so much. Big round of applause for Charlie. Also getting through that without, I don't think there's a single cough. Charlie, congratulations on both fronts. And a final round of applause just for both our speakers today. That was absolutely fascinating. That wheelbarrow analogy at the end actually hurt me, Charlie. Oh Christ, I feel that one deep. I've been trudging up a hill with a wheelbarrow with a square wheel for years. Why did no one tell me? Phil pointed out a very interesting parallel between the 2 books, and I suppose it's summarized in self-sabotage. It does leave me with the question: what the bloody hell is wrong with us? Why do we want to self-sabotage on so many fronts? A specific question, Charlie, for you is: you got a sense why we hold on to these old models of running an organization when anyone that's worked in even like a smaller organization, even of 100 folks, agrees that it's bloody painful and it's broken? What's stopping us from making progress?
That's a great question. If I had a crystal answer, I think I'd have made my millions, right? Because I'd have revolutionized organizations. But no, I mean, I genuinely think it's about power. I think it's because we don't realize when we join a company, on role description written here, you're here to do these 5 things. You don't realize you can change how you do those 5 things. You're here to do those 5 things. And I think we sort of slot into an existing structure, way of doing things, and we don't realize we have the potential to change it. And then you often have these CEOs that come in with a huge change agenda, wanting to do it. But like I say, the traditional models of how you do it is sort of top down, big consulting effort, multi-year long plan. And everyone's seen those go off a cliff, nothing changes. So I just think there's a not realization that people can do this locally, and B, there's not enough awareness of some of those kind of ways to get started. I think we always want to control things, and actually experiment driven approaches like this is not being in control as much. So I think there's a kind of need to let go to try different ways of doing things. But yeah, I think you do see the emergence of some change, right? I think some startups, whether it's the 4-day week, whether it's the working from home, whether it's the cross-functional teams that run in sort of agile sort of nodes and do things in their own ways, you do see those glimmers of hope. I think it's the big old-fashioned organizations or the larger organizations that are way behind. That's a very long answer, short question.
No, not at all. I'd say, yeah, I think, sorry, I'm not quite sure it is because it's appearing as iPhone, but yeah, it's the human nature, I suppose, trust, control, power, that's sort of stopping us work in a more sensible way.
I think it's also about role models, isn't it? Most, if you look at a normal distribution, most fields of endeavor are clustered around the average. So when you look around for role models, you're most likely to encounter things that are average or normal, and it's much harder to see the exceptions, hopefully the good exceptions at the right-hand side of that distribution. And you see that in everything, I think.
That's a really interesting point.
By the way, thank you. That intersection and roundabout metaphor has made my day a lot easier and more productive. I am stealing that. Thank you.
Very happy to share it. If you need more, Phil, just let me know, because there's a couple of pages I can just take a photo and send to you with the descriptions if it's useful.
I might take you up on that. I'll see how I get on. But I'm buying both books. Thank you both. Definitely both.
Yeah, just going to come back to something from your book, Annalise, as well. Not your book, or you can claim that you wrote it. The book that you
Yes,
talked
I
about
wrote
today.
it.
Well done, it's a cracker. Yeah, I'm still to get to the bottom of why. I thought that, and we've talked about this before, but it sort of seems a sensible thing and a lovely thing to say that we are caretakers of the earth, and it's 100% the other way around. I don't quite know how we have come to that conclusion, mainly through arrogance, that we think we can pilot this this massive planet and be sort of, yeah, the caretakers of it. And what was my question? I don't know if there's anything in the book that sort of covers how we came to adopt that mindset. And I'll leave one other thing that sort of plays into this is, it's I think a quote I've shared before, but by oh my god, my brain is not working. But it's you don't come into this earth, you know, we actually come out of it.
Yeah, Alan Watts.
Alan Watts, sorry, yeah. And yeah, how do we come to think that we are this sort of special little species that can caretake, that we've been born into it and we've not come out of it, we're so detached.
I think a lot of it comes from this idea that, or the place where we're at now, where nature, for not for everybody, but for the majority of maybe the modern world, is this abstract thing. So it's something that's not, they're not a part of, they're not in it. We live in like brick houses. Like, I'm not saying we go back to like straw huts or anything, or start sleeping out in woodland. But we've completely separated ourselves from it. And it's almost like we're up in a castle. I think it's the way that he doesn't quite describe it this way, but we are above it all. So we have all these tools, we're highly intelligent. We're the most intelligent kind of dominating species on the planet. Like, we've triumphed over anything, nothing can kill us. I think it comes back to that point of, we're kind of like the top predator, I guess, on the planet. So therefore, and with that, we've kind of got all this technology and these tools which allow us to dominate nature. And against that, I guess they don't really stand a chance. Like, we have weapons, we've got machines which can plow through their homes. Like, they literally don't have a chance against us in that sense. So in that way, I guess we have come to this point where we can conquer nature, but ultimately it's to our own detriment. And I do think it's things like the emergence of kind of the virtual world, and which is great. And on one hand, it's amazing and kind of what it's given people, but also it's also to our detriment. It's like all these things come with a bit of a caveat of like, they're great, but they have a negative effect on other things. And yeah, like, to kind of come back to the original point, I think it's this idea that nature is so abstract to a lot of people now that yeah, they don't see themselves alongside it. It's definitely like, we're here to save it, whereas actually we need to just stop and let it just work in the way it's meant to work. But it's finding a balance, I guess, and learning to coexist, because we have got to a point where we live in a certain way, which is hard to go back from. But cities like Singapore and like these biophilic cities, and kind of making room for nature, and there's a scientist called E.O. Wilson, who is, I've not read the book, I've bought it, one of the many books I've bought and not read, but it's called the Half Earth Project, and it's basically about creating, he's got this theory that if we made half of the earth available for the natural world, and made half of the earth available for humans, and kind of gave everyone their space and kind of where it needs to be, that could be an answer to a solution to a lot of our problems.
It's interesting. There's a book, I can't remember the name of the author, it's a science fiction book set in the near future called The Ministry for the Future.
Yes.
That Half Earth project plays out. So he does a sort of thought experiment in the book. You know, as this trend towards urbanization continues, human beings migrate to cities, it actually creates that half Earth space. So it was a sort of glimmer of hope in an otherwise quite gloomy book.
Oh, that's good that you said that, because I started that book and I actually, like, it gave me so much anxiety in the first couple of chapters that I stopped. And one of my friends said, keep reading, it does get hopeful. So that's good to know.
No, it does. It's a mixed bag, let's say that.
Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned as well that we're so lonely, and we're really keen not to, be alone in the universe. But we have so much life here on Earth, and we don't really recognise it anymore. It reminds me of the line at the end of "Don't look up." Don't know if anyone's watched that documentary film, however you want to see it, but one of the final lines, and I'll totally paraphrase this, but we really had it all, didn't we? We fail to recognize that and want more and want to find other forms of intelligence, and we kind of have it all here now, but are very keen to destroy it for some insane reason. That's a depressing thought, isn't it? Good night, children.
I was going to say, you could end it on a nice thought and just say, I was going to recommend next time you go out for a walk, put your phone in your pocket, take your headphones off, and just tune into the world around you. And it's a nice way to become just aware. And it's everywhere. I'm aware we're going over, but the other point I'd like to make is that having access to nature is quite a privilege. And it's it's a kind of another form of like inequality that we're seeing in terms of like who gets access to the natural world. So, but it is everywhere. It's in all our urban environments.
I agree. As you said earlier, you don't have to have a moment with a panther.
Well, you could, but he doesn't recommend that.
Well, thanks to our two speakers and everyone for everyone joining this morning. It's given me like a ton of things to think about, and as normal, I want to dig into those books. But we'll leave it there for just now. And yeah, hopefully do this again next month. But yeah, thanks everyone, and take care today. I've got so many more questions that I want to ask, but luckily I know both you, Charlie and Annalise, will have a chat another time.
Thanks,
okay, folks.
It's been really
Thank
good.
you, everyone. Thanks,
Thank
Charlie.
you.
Have good days.
Bye.
You too. Bye bye.
5 Things.